My name is Ruth Cox and I'm a paintings conservator. I own a private conservation studio in Durham, North Carolina. And I've been working with Biltmore for over 5 years, around 5 years, treating the pictures in the collection. Prior to working on this collection, I've worked on numerous collections throughout North Carolina and the Southeast. My specialty is old master paintings, and I trained at Winterthur Museum and Gardens years ago as a paintings conservator, after which I was awarded a Mellon Fellowship at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and was there for 3 years, working primarily on old master paintings. I then moved to North Carolina to be with my husband and set up my own studio. And I've loved being in North Carolina. Whenever I start an examination of a picture, the first thing I do is write a pretty extensive examination report and treatment proposal. And that usually takes several weeks. In this case, I came to Biltmore and gathered a lot of the initial data here on site. And then when the pictures came to my studio, I re-examined them and made sure no adjustments needed to be made to the treatments we'd proposed. So once I actually started working on the picture and we'd done photo documentation of the painting before treatment, it took about four to 6 months to treat each picture. And it's just in between cleaning, using different solvents, and letting the picture rest and to think about how much further to go. And then with the actual compensation work, it does take a little bit of time to decide, is it appropriate to retouch here or retouch there? Is there loss? So it's not as if I'm working 24/7 on these pictures for 4 to 6 months, but it is a fair amount of time. And some of the most important time is actually when I'm not working on it, when I'm just letting things think and settle in my mind before I approach the next step. The Monets, when they came, were not in terrible physical condition. The main issues with the pictures were their aesthetic presentation. So what that means is that the surfaces didn't really look appropriate to Monet. They weren't reading well. For instance, in the Belle-Île, the dark area of cliffs on the right-hand side of the picture was very flat, and you couldn't really see the colors that were in there. And it also had a tiny bit of instability. There were some areas where the paint was flaking a little bit, and there were several very minor paint losses. So the painting was structurally stable for the most part, with the exception of a few areas where the paint was flaking off the surface. So the very first thing to do was to stabilize those areas of weakness using a reversible adhesive, an adhesive that could be fed into the cracks under the microscope and that would keep the rest of the paint in that weakened area from falling off the painting, basically. We are adding paint to the paintings, but only in areas of loss, only where we know paint has literally been removed and we can see what tone, what color needs to be in to bridge that loss. So if you have two sides of a brush stroke and the middle part is lost, you see what was at the beginning and the end and you bring them back together. The type of paint we use is readily distinguishable using an ultraviolet light. So any scholar looking at this painting will know what I had added and what is original to the picture. The Strada Romana, which means the Roman way, is the other picture that I conserved recently. And compared to the Belle Ile, there was a lot more retouching that needed to be done on this picture. Likewise, it had a synthetic coating that had grayed and dulled the picture. It also had remnants of an earlier natural resin varnish underneath that synthetic varnish, which needed to be removed so that the vibrancy of the palette could be revealed again. So the cleaning was a little more complicated, and there was a lot more old retouching on the picture. This showed up very clearly in ultraviolet light examination before I started treatment. So I knew when I was taking paint off that it was restoration paint and not originally Monet's paint. One of the big tenets of conservation is that all the materials we use should be reversible, meaning if our restorations or anything we put on this picture doesn't age well or ages differentially from the rest of the picture and needs to be removed, it should be readily removable without any damage being incurred by the painting. It should also be distinguishable from any paint that we add to cover damages or little losses in the paint film. All of the retouching we do should likewise be reversible with mild solvents so we don't endanger or hurt the picture. It wasn't a terribly extensive treatment. The issues were primarily aesthetic in the way the painting is being presented and how we're viewing it. Structurally, it was stable. So what was required was the removal of this synthetic varnish that had been put on in the early 80s and become gray. And after doing a lot of research on Monet, the pictures that he painted in 1886, when this picture was painted, he did not usually add an overall varnish. He didn't like the paintings to look and to be coated evenly with a heavy layer of resin that would essentially squash the liveliness of the paint film. So having a layer of synthetic that evened out the surface in a way that Monet didn't intended wasn't appropriate. So aside from it's not looking well on the picture any longer, ethically it really shouldn't have been on there to begin with. So I removed the varnish and was able to do so using a type of gel that wouldn't leave the paint film raw and crazed looking and dry, but allowed it to kind of regain its old luster just as a paint, as the paint would have looked pretty much when he painted it. There were a few areas in the picture that required a little bit of additional varnish being rubbed into the surface in order to bring out the colors because of the past cleaning cycles that the picture had undergone. Of course, it would be fabulous to have a fully stocked lab with all kinds of wonderful imaging techniques at my fingertips. That is not really the case being in a private studio. So I do have a really fabulous stereoscopic microscope, and I have a room that I can darken to do ultraviolet illumination. But mainly it's a matter of having a number of solvents, and I use solvents, I make different solvent gels. You have to have a good background in chemistry to be able to clean pictures appropriately and to be a conservator. But you know, it's as silly as using swab sticks, which are little kind of like almost what you use to test a cake. those cake testers, the bamboo skewers, and you wrap cotton to different densities on the tip of it, and you clean using that and dipping it in a solvent, and it removes, if you studied it properly, you remove the varnish. And brushes, there are different kinds of brushes. I use sable hair brushes for retouching. They're very expensive. It's can be $20, $30 a brush. And then you have wider varnishing brushes when it's appropriate to varnish. But as I said, in these cases, we didn't want a varnish surface. When I rubbed varnish into the darkened areas, I actually used a piece of Chinese silk that I made a French polish pad kind of thing out of. Take a piece of silk and you put a big ball of cotton in it and coat it down, and then just rub gently, dip it in a little bit of varnish and rub it into the surface and buff it a little bit until you get the saturation you want. And it doesn't leave a hard glossy film, it just saturates and enriches a paint film that's been a little bit denatured. It was so much fun. I love research, and so doing the research on Monet and his different periods, even several years apart, he was painting slightly differently, and getting to understand what he was really aiming for and try to bring the pictures as close visually to his original intent as possible. Of course, they can't look precisely the way they looked when they left his easel. That's impossible. But being for a lot of knowledge and research informed how they're now presented here at Biltmore.